Right, let's go. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. This is the first webinar in a series on waste and recycling communications. Thank you for signing up and for attending. For those that don't already know me, I'm John Paul from CAN, and I helped start CAN, which is a public sector campaigns agency. And over the past decade, we've been asked by many public sector organisations to help amplify their waste and recycling communications. And working with those organisations on relatively similar projects has given us a fairly unique perspective. And we want to share this perspective with you. The reason for this group is really to have a series of easy to access free events that help you stay abreast of developments, understand what's working, understand what's not, and to help give you things that you can take away and apply and use in your day-to-day work. We want as well for this to be an opportunity for you to share examples of what you've done where you are, and share that with the entire group. There'll be events coming up, and we'll share details of that in the future. But today, we're going to dig into the barriers to increasing recycling rates, reducing consumption, and we're really going to focus in on how you might separate what is a challenge for a service from what is a challenge for communications. We find that that's a common issue when we're given briefs, to get to the bottom of what things are actually about physical service provision or elements of people's environments that stand in the way, and what things are awareness and nudging challenges. And we'll be sharing some tried and tested insight and techniques that have been applied that you can hopefully take away and apply yourselves. You may be familiar with Dominic Ridley-Moy. He runs the Behaviour Change Network, and I'm very pleased that he's here today to help us on this front. It's probably worth zooming in on why should we focus on improving waste and recycling communications before we go forward. I think there's some very simple reasons. One is that there's definitely a lot of room for improvement. There's a huge disparity between campaigns that work really well and campaigns that maybe there's opportunity for improvement. We're also facing a situation where resources are going to get tighter and tighter. So our capacity for tolerating suboptimal and inefficient behaviours is going to reduce, and also that just not because it's possible, but also by improving, there are so many positive impacts, not just cost savings, but also cost savings for, not cost savings for services, but cost savings for residents, and obviously the impact on the climate from reduced consumption and increased recycling. And it's also possible. This session is about sharing and giving you some things that will help make life much easier for you. So the hope and inspiration comes from sharing and collaboration. You being here is part of that. We hope regularly to help you get to the elements of behaviour change or behavioural science that help us understand decision-making, human psychology, so we can weave it into campaigns. There's a lot of new technology being talked about, but we'll be trying to find examples of technology that isn't vaporware and is actually useful and proven. And then hopefully together we'll be able to improve incrementally as a group, and this group's function is to help accelerate that. So today, as I alluded to earlier, we want to dig in a little bit to what are service problems and what are communications problems. And this is so important because before you start to get to a communications brief, you need to understand what's down to issues that, physical barriers, perception barriers, and so on. And someone who we've worked with in the past is Dominic Ridley-Moy. So Dominic, it'd be really great if you'd introduce yourself and then take us through some of the things that you've learned recently.
So thank you, John Paul. So my name's Dominic Ridley-Moy, and for those of you who don't know me, I run the Behaviour Change Network. And today I'm just going to take you through a number of things that I've learned over the years working with lots of different local authorities, particularly around contamination, and some insights there. So some practical takeaways that you can use in your organisation to reduce contamination. So I am going to hopefully share my screen if the technology is going to work okay for me. Excellent, good. So that seems to be working fine, which is always good. So, so today is all about thinking about contamination, basically, and what we can all do to solve that in our organisations. So it's very much thinking about kind of, as John Paul was saying, what is the problem that you want to solve? So if you saw me speak a few weeks ago, this was the slide I started off with, and I'm going to share it again because I think it's really important to get to the bottom of the problem. So what is the problem? What is contamination? What is the behaviour or behaviours that you're trying to shift? And this is the bit where I always spend most time and suggest you do the same. Because at the end of the day, behaviour change isn't hard as long as you do the upfront thinking. And that's the most important bit of any behaviour change campaign. So I'm just going to say a bit more about the theory before we go into kind of practical examples and what you can be doing. So this is my own behavioural framework that I've developed over a number of years, which is all about making it easier for busy comms managers, waste managers, recycling managers, people working in those sorts of roles to apply behavioural insights. And for me, the process is spending a lot of time working out what is the behaviour you want to shift and examining those barriers. So as you can see on the screen, there's a lot that is about working out what is the behaviour you want to shift. So what are your objectives as a service? What are the key contaminants you want to shift? Thinking about getting that insight, looking at the kind of long list of behaviours. So thinking about what's happening, what are the different contaminants that we might want to target, why are people behaving in a certain way, looking at kind of segments and stuff like that, and then whittling it down to a short list of behaviours before you think about some of the barriers that you can potentially target. And then finally, the last bit would be very much thinking around what is it you do to run your campaign and evaluation. But for me, it's really all about doing that upfront thinking. And that's what I would argue is the most important bit. And sometimes there is a tendency and we can skip that. So as John Paul was saying earlier, one thing that's really, really important is that with waste and recycling, all those kinds of issues in general, definitely with contamination, service delivery and communications go hand in hand. It's really difficult to work in silos. And one of the things I've found really, really helpful over the years is having a joint project group between the service and communications. So you're working together because so many things are intertwined when it comes to recycling and getting people to do the right thing. So when it comes to contamination, what is the actual problem? So many of you may have seen these stats before. So this is from RAP, the font of all knowledge of these kind of things. And this is from their annual tracker. So this is from last year, looking at recycling rates and things like that across the UK. So 90% of UK citizens regularly recycle. So it's a normalised behaviour. It's a lot of things that people do. A lot of people recycle. A lot of people see the benefit of recycling. But still, the problem is that contamination is high. So something like more than 80% of people put the wrong things into their recycling. And a lot of the time, people are wanting to do the right thing, but not quite getting it right. And also there's a lot of serious contaminants as well. So something like 37% at the last time this was done. So that's the kind of things that where people are putting something like a sanitary product into the recycling, something that causes a real problem for the recycling facility. So there's a number of different things there. So sometimes a lot of the time it's people want to do the right thing but don't quite manage to. Other times there'll be people who are just not doing the right thing at all and possibly don't want to. So in terms of, if we look at this in a bit more detail, and how many people are disposing of things incorrectly. So this is basically, on an average collection round, people will dispose of something like 5.4 items incorrectly. So it's improved a little bit since 2021, but it's still a big issue. So that's something that we really need to look at. What are those things that people getting wrong, so we can get people to recycle more of the right things more often? And another point I'll keep coming back to. So confusion about what you can and can't recycle nationally and locally is a big issue. So one of the things that's really important is thinking about consistency of message. So the Recycle Now swoosh has that kind of consistency to it and people understand it. So it's worth bearing that in mind, and something I'll come back to. Okay, so where do you start? How do you work out what the problem is? How do you decide what contamination to focus on and what not to? So my first port of call would always be to speak to the service, spend some quality time with the waste and recycling service, thinking about what data is out there. So the types of things you can interrogate, depending on your local authority, will be things like contamination data by round. The waste composition analysis, which I spend lots of time reading through. So looking at different trends. So what kind of things are causing issues in general? What are the things that people across your local authority area are getting wrong? Also, what can the crews on the ground tell you? Not something that people always do. So thinking about what are they saying are hotspot areas? Which parts of your borough, your local authority, where are people getting it wrong, and what are the kind of key issues? And also surveys, focus groups, door knocking, all those kinds of things, as you would expect, are really, really useful. I just worked with a client on a massive door knocking exercise, and that was so useful to find out what the barriers were around contamination, and also photos as well, which I will come on to next. So when it comes to something like, if you've got a number of kind of housing estates in your local area, walkabouts can be really, really helpful. So walking around an estate and looking at things like where bins are located, what are people putting in the bins, what can you see is happening? Are there recycling and household bins next to each other or not? Are the bins damaged? Are they overflowing? What are those kind of environmental barriers? So what's happening in your environment around you that's making a big difference? And that's something that we really need to look at carefully. So when you're planning your campaigns around contamination, once you've got that data, it's also worth thinking about looking at how you segment your audiences by living circumstances. So people who live in households versus housing estates / communal bin recycling will behave very differently to, say, people who live in flats and in different types of flats. So maybe flats in a block of flats versus flats above shops, and also families versus single households. There's a lot of trends you can see there. So it's worth thinking what's happening within those very discrete segments. So as I said earlier, when it comes to recycling and contamination, there's multiple barriers that we can look through and think about that will drive what people do. So if we want to bring it back to the theory, so one of the models I use is COMB, which is around things like capabilities around knowledge, opportunities around what's happening in your environment. And then there's things like motivation, about what people's attitudes are, what habits they have in place. And this is why it's important for the service and communications to join up, because a lot of the time there'll be multiple barriers to why people do and don't do the right thing when it comes to contamination. So if we take estates-based recycling, a lot of the times awareness will be the biggest or a very big issue, but actually with communal bins recycling bins being full, people not trusting that it's going to get recycled, a lack of bins, lack of space in flats, missed bins, all those kinds of things, overflowing bins, all those things tied together to make a big, big difference to what people will do or not do. And also one thing that's really interesting is I run a lot of focus groups, and one of the things that comes out of that for me is that people have quite long memories, and it's quite interesting. So here's a conversation from a focus group about people. Someone said, oh yes, you could definitely use orange sacks for recycling. Someone else saying, oh no, you can only use clear bags. And people tend to have quite long memories when it comes to your policy on what you do with recycling. And sometimes if there's slightly different nuanced messages across the website or slightly different messages, things like that, that can confuse people quite easily. So having a really clear policy on what you can and can't put in the recycling, and then also what you can put, what sort of bags you can and can't put it in, and repeating that message over and over again is really important, because there is such a challenge with communicating what you can and can't recycle. So I'm going to move on now a bit to what the solution is. So we talked a bit about kind of behaviours, a bit about where you start. So what is it that we can all do in our organisations to tackle contamination? So for me, focusing on key contaminants is really important, and certainly where I've worked with organisations on thinking about what are the key things you want to shift and focusing on those in your communications. So if we bring it back to the theory, if you communicate too much to people, sometimes it can be a bit off-putting and they can't take it in. So yes, a leaflet or poster saying here are the things you can recycle and can't recycle is important, but it's a lot of information. So where I've done things and we've just focused on one or two items at a time. So if people are putting too much polystyrene in the wrong place, just focusing on polystyrene, or just focusing on nappies and just thinking what are those key contaminants that people are getting wrong, we're much more likely to take that in, because a lot of the time we can't take in too much information. Also, consistency is really, really important. So when we're communicating with residents, consistency of the language we use, and also images around signs, bins, products in supermarkets, all those kinds of things, the more consistent it is, the more that people will understand what to do, because it's an area where people get conflicting messages. So it's just something to be really aware of. However, I would argue, and this is my personal view, that there is an exception to that, and that novelty can have a place. So as humans, we make something like 35,000 decisions a day. So here's some work that myself and John Paul have worked with an agency called Alive with Ideas, and this is a campaign we worked on for Tower Hamlets Council. So this was very much about doing something novel and fresh. So when you're doing something like a social media campaign, you're competing with lots of other graphics and images. So doing something a bit different and getting people's attention, disrupting their attention, is really, really important. And also having that clear kind of call to action. So again, it's kind of simple messages, not too many messages, and then just thinking about how you use that. And also in general, it's worth thinking about what disrupts people's attention. So a lot of the time when we're communicating about contamination, it's about how can we get that message in front of people. And I'm sure John Paul's going to talk later about how you do that online. But thinking about how do we use something like letters. So I certainly don't get many letters these days. So letters are really good because they disrupt our attention. And also how we use envelopes, text messages, all that kind of thing. So thinking about how can you push messages out in a way that is novel and a bit different from the norm. And also, where are people when they're getting the message around contamination. So people will be conducting the behaviour that we're thinking about, often by the fridge or by the bin. So what communications do you have in those places? So having those kind of bin hanger sticker thingamybobs can be really, really useful. And I know lots of local authorities use that, kind of just saying to people, we didn't take your recycling because it was contaminated with X or Y. So having that feedback loop that's associated with the actual behaviour makes a big difference. And this, for me, this is where it gets really interesting, and I like to spend a lot of time here. So thinking about design. So when you design in behavioural terms, it can be a bit different from when you would design normally. So you're thinking about actually some colour, but not too much colour, potentially making it nice and simple. So people, when they look at something and look away, they get a very clear sense of what you need to do or not do. So here's a sign that we started off with lots of information, took loads of it out, basically. So it was basically thinking, if we did one thing and nothing else, what would that thing be? So in this area, it was loads of black bags were going into the recycling. So actually just highlighting that message is, this is how you can do your recycling, don't put any black bags in, and these are the things we want you to recycle. Nothing else makes a big difference. It's some messages, some colour, but not too much. And this also comes back to my point earlier that just walking around and taking the time to work out what the problem again will make your communication so much more effective. And also, one of the things that you can do, and again, I'm sure John Paul will talk about this in a bit more detail in a second, when we're trialing things online, is that it's always worth testing different things. And I like the approach of trying one thing, seeing if it works, then trying it again. If it doesn't work, try something else. So lots of little testing in a similar way to Agile, if you've come across that before, which is used much more in project management. So small interventions that you change over and over again. And then what you can do is you can do things like street A gets one leaflet, street B doesn't get a leaflet. Testing different messages with different letters, different leaflets, so similar streets, to see what difference that makes with contamination. And if you're able to get the data from that round, that's really, really helpful. Okay, so just to summarise then, in terms of the key things that I would suggest you do and how you can work through contamination, it's thinking about what are the specific behaviours you want to change? What is the problem? Getting that really good insight. And then think about, when you're looking at that data, what can you see by different audiences? So how do houses behave? How do flats behave? Can you see any hotspot areas? Designing for behaviour change is really key. So thinking about how you disrupt people's attention. Are they getting something offline? Are they getting something online? What are the different ways you can communicate? Consistency is key. So having consistent language throughout what you do is really important. And also think about, how do you attract people's attention? How do you get them to take action and have simple messages that aren't too difficult to consume? And then I always say test and retest, because that's really, really helpful. And there's lots of ways you can do it to see if things are working or not working. So that is me. So that's a very quick whistle-stop tour of some thoughts on tackling contamination.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dominic. That's really interesting. Always good to refresh on what the principles are. And I think there can be no substitute for getting out there, looking around, seeing what's actually happening, and then, as you say, speaking to people. Often it's something that, not enough time is allocated to, but on the campaigns I've worked on where you've been there, that insight has really helped hone the messaging so that you can keep it simple. Thank you. One quick question for you. Richard Harkin said, is that 5.4 per collection?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, that
yeah,
was
it
okay.
is. Yeah, I've already answered it, but yeah, I just as you were speaking,
I see.
I
So I
answered
thought you were
it.
saying yes, that's right to me. I was very sorry. This is going great in terms of tech, isn't it? I wanted to back up some of the things you were saying. Looking here at an array of different ads, zooming in on very particular messages. Here you can see in Tower Hamlets there was some survey activity, and then a period of creative development, and then very simple messaging towards the end. And in order to intercept people's attention, one place we used that worked particularly well was Snapchat. Targeting that sort of 18 plus audience. There's a lot more of those people on there, and the interaction rates were absolutely fantastic on it. And it helped Dominic see where the gaps in awareness were, what people thought and what people at scale. So he'd done the quality work on the ground. We were then able to check at much greater scale what where the gaps in knowledge were and how those correlated with the type of property you were in. And then we were able to see from that which messages afterwards resonated most with people. One thing you're often looking for is declining rates of interaction. You're trying to see, is there a point where what we're saying is not generating the same click-through rates as before, and making the point there about particularly some of the great creatives that rap provide, there can be issues where you get diminishing returns from using them. So tailoring content to local areas, mentioning roads or micro areas can be really powerful. It helps the brain go, this is meant for me, rather than something that I've seen multiple times before. And then putting that in the places where people are is also very powerful. Being able to see as well if messages resonate differently with different audiences, again, can help augment what you've already done in terms of that quality work on the ground. So it's a wonderful opportunity where you can do the high quality work, but then you can use technology to scale that very, very quickly. Thank you again, Dominic. I'm just going to quickly check the questions. Fine for this moment. Now, I'd like, if possible, to launch a quick poll, because this series of events, we've kind of guessed this first one, but we really want to make sure that the next events that we do match your priorities. So I just wondered if you could tick the boxes here of the sorts of subjects you think would be most useful to you. And then we can start to make sure that the next event is something pertinent. We know food waste seems to be a big issue for most people, but we'd also like to look at what else we should prioritize in order to be most useful to you. And if any of you have excellent examples with dealing with these kinds of challenges, please do get in touch, and we'd love to feature you in one of these events. It doesn't matter where you work or how big your campaign is. There's often gold that's gone on. Something you might not think is that amazing actually stands out, brilliantly amongst other people. So as I mentioned, the next event is going to be, I didn't need to do that share. The next event is going to be on April the 17th, and we'll be focusing on food waste. We'll collect your data now on the topics. Drop Dominic a line if you want him to come to your area and get under the skin of what the challenges are in your area. Can't recommend working with him enough. And do drop me a line if you want to see any insight or what data has been derived from delivering campaigns in other locations. All of the stuff that we send out to you for insight is free, and we can also tell you what people are searching for in your local area. Fly tipping, yes, sorry, that is a particular tricky one, but Dominic has some experience in that, and we've run some campaigns there too. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Dominic, for sharing your expertise with us. It's really appreciated, and we hope to see you all on the next event. Until then, goodbye for now.